the continuation of the series that I guess, Amy, you started this?
It was actually Jane Stein started.
Oh, did she?
Yeah.
Okay, great, because she did the first one.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Well, I've been asked to do my story. But my story is really long, so this is a slice of my story today. I've already heard people that are disappointed they're not going to get other parts of it, but that's the way it's going to have to be today if we're going to get done with this thing. And the slice of it today that I'm going to focus on is my professional career, which was also about equally interesting to my personal life through those years. So it's going to focus, as it says there, on hospital birthing in the United States, 1880 to the present, specifically the neonatal intensive care unit, LDR, the LDRP rooms, in obstetrics, and how those transitions happened, and what my role, my story was within those transitions. So that is, and I will leave the lights up. This is nap time, so feel free if you need to. That's fine, I understand. I'm used to talking to physicians. You don't have to turn your cell phones off. Nothing bothers me. Don't anybody keel over. That would stop things. But otherwise, we just keep rolling, and we'll get through this in roughly an hour. So let me do a little quick, let me see how yeah, this still works nice. As an introduction, I want to ask who in the room is or was involved in healthcare. We got quite a few. All right, great. Got some nurses, any doctors here today? No doctor in the house? Okay. Try and stay upright. But I'd rather have a nurse care for me if I keel over than a doctor. We'll say that since it's not here. And I appreciate that. Okay, now another question for you. How many in this room have given birth before 1980? Anybody in here that's given birth since 1980? Anybody who has been with their children or grandchildren when they gave birth since 1980? Got a few over here, okay, all right. Well, I think you're gonna kind of feel comfortable with some of this that's coming up, and might answer a few questions that you've had. I'm gonna start with a disclaimer, because I've been blessed personally in the things that I've accomplished in my lifetime and that I'm gonna talk about here today. But don't take it as if I did this stuff by myself. It would be impossible, number one. But number two, I had some of the finest physicians and nurses, caregivers of all types that also helped consult with and guide me through the things that I accomplished in my professional life. And I just want that understood up front. There's nothing here that I did solo. I had tremendous resources from Abbott and Ross Laboratories, as well as others. I certainly had the support of my wife, Sally. You all probably know her and know that she was able to keep things copacetic at home while I flew for more than 5 million miles to different places to work with the hospitals and to do the writings. I've got some books that I've written up here on the table afterwards if you're wanting to look at anything. And I was specifically protected by the Lord, who kept exotic diseases, coups, truly evil people, snakes, and many airline mishaps from killing me along the way. So technically, I shouldn't be here today. But the Lord was watching over me in many cases, and so I managed my way through that with Sally's support. We each have a path in life. The people that live here at Rolling Green Village are spectacular. I love listening to the paths that they've had in life. And this is just a little bit about mine. Start with the beginning. This goes way back. I was born, this is what I tell my grandchildren when they ask me, how old are you, Papa? And I say I was born in the first half of the last century in a previous millennium. And they have to figure it out. You guys don't have to. I'm going to tell you it was 1946. That was the front edge of the baby boom, as you all know. So that influenced me, and it influenced the things that I did in my career. There wasn't any TV, there were no computers, and the band at practice had only one note, so it was easy to play things. I grew up in Cleveland and Miami, so two ends, not in the middle now. My early teenage jobs included sledgehammering concrete reinforced slabs at age 11 for 6 weeks. I was issued a pair of gloves and a sledgehammer, and I pounded on those suckers for 6 weeks to break them down into small chunks so they could be hauled away. What I didn't know at the time was this is work they normally give to prisoners, and secondly, I didn't know how strong I was becoming as I was doing this. I just did it every day for whatever, 7 or 8 hours a day. I pounded on cement. And I went back to school in 7th grade as a kid stronger than most of the teachers. And that was impressive to me, and I had no idea it was going to happen. Third, catching and selling poisonous snakes, mostly water moccasins at age 12. At age 13, I worked for the mafia collecting money. I had some interesting jobs. That work I did mostly in the middle of the night from about 2 to 4 a.m. Hot dog vendor at age 14, learned to work with people. I was a lifeguard and a swim club manager from 15 to 19 in my summer times. My first medical job was as a respiratory therapist. It was called oxygen therapy then, at the Cleveland Clinic. And don't ask why they let a 20-year-old have that job. So that was kind of a collection of a variety of things that I did. I was raised as a free-range child, mostly my father's responsibility. But that's a quick overview of where I came from. From a medical background, I went on and earned a master's degree from Duke University, Duke Medical Center, in 1970 in healthcare administration. And I used that to get a job at age 24. I was hired by a hospital consulting firm rather than going and administering a hospital. I did a lot of that in the 2 years that I was at Duke, including being the night administrator at Duke University Medical Center, which led to a number of very interesting situations. One of which was very much like what we had up in Minneapolis that started a whole lot of riots up there, where the police shot a black man in the back as he was fleeing through the door of the emergency room. And that's another story for another day. But I got to handle sticky situations. I did the largest strategic plan ever in the United States. It involved 110 hospitals simultaneously in the Dallas-Fort Worth 16-county area. I was 26 when I did that, and it was a solo project. So I finished by writing a 3-volume report and followed it for 20 years. It was a 20-year plan. Followed it for 20 years, and they did most everything that I recommended they should be doing. Mergers, acquisitions, bringing together allopaths and osteopaths, merging children's hospitals, and so forth. I planned over my career 50% of all neonatal intensive care units in the United States. So I was very active in that specific area. And I managed, while I was doing that, I managed offices in Beirut, Lebanon, and Lagos, Nigeria. So I had a Middle East and an African practice, and that I'll probably come back to in a minute, because a lot of it involved midwives. I taught at Meharry Medical School, which was the black medical school in Nashville, Tennessee. It's now part of Vanderbilt, and I taught a lot of midwives there whose practices were in Africa. And then I met with them in Africa to see how their practices were going. So it was an interesting connection. I led the largest facility plan ever. Anybody familiar with the Denver area? And there we go. It was the movement of the University of Colorado Medical Center and Children's Hospital to the Fitzsimmons Army campus in Aurora. And that campus is 600 acres in size. It was a $5 billion project. It involved hundreds of buildings. And the University of Colorado moved off the side of the hill onto that campus as it was created in 2007, 2008. Here is that campus. It's huge. It's blocks and blocks of space. And if anybody knows Fitzsimmons or its history, it has quite a history. President Eisenhower stayed there 3 times with heart issues. They called it the Western White House for a while. And it was there in World War I. It was there as a tuberculosis hospital, one of the biggest in the country. But now that's all gone, except for we had to keep the old Fitzsimmons Hospital here in the middle. We converted it to offices for the faculty members and administrators and so forth. And the new University of Colorado Medical Center occupies that. The Children's Hospital here. There's a beautiful VA corner over there on the property. So a lot of really good things happened on that campus, but it was, and I just say as a disclaimer that the Texas Medical Center in Houston is bigger. And I say this was the biggest. This was the biggest that was done as one project. Texas grew over the years, and it's massive. But this is pretty big as well. So there I was, you know, pretty young yet, and I got into in hospitals specializing in women's and children's health care, which obviously involved birthing and NICUs, tiny babies. And I thought it might be fun to go back and look at what was happening with tiny babies back in the 1880s up to the 1940 mark. As Casey Stengel said, making predictions is always difficult, particularly when they're about the future. Yogi didn't say that, Casey said that. Well, my job basically as a consultant was to look into the future and prepare hospitals and medical centers for the future that would be in front of them. So I became a pretty good prognosticator. However, there were people in the past who didn't do that job so well. Air travel at high speeds above 20 miles an hour. It's not possible because passengers will be unable to breathe and die of asphyxia. This was Dr. Lardner when he saw trains. Good enough for our transatlantic friends, but unworthy of the attention of practical or scientific men. This was a British Parliament report on Edison's work at the time. And we were the transatlantic friends. Heavier than air flying machines are impossible. Lord Kelvin, for heaven's sakes, we know him. The Kelvin system and so forth, president of the Royal Society. He wasn't buying it. Guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein. Decca Records executive Dick Rowe to the Beatles manager Brian Epstein, explaining the label's decision to pass on the Beatles. Yeah, right. The telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. When's the last time anybody got a telegram? Who the hell wants to hear actors talk? Harry Warner, the Warner Brothers. You can see it's not easy to predict the future. It's not easy to know what's coming and what's going to be popular. Care of the newborn for when medical science stepped in the late 1800s, did a lot of things, most of them wrong. Remember, they killed George Washington, they bled him to death. We've stopped doing bleedings, basically. And they killed Meriwether Lewis by treating him with mercury, which made him insane before he died. I love medical caregivers of all types, doctors, nurses, support people. They're trying to cure us of our ills and keep us alive. I have no problem with that. But remember, they are practicing a craft. And it's never settled, as we hear sometimes, and ever changing. So we need to cut them a little slack, a little, not as much as I'm going to show you here. The incubator. We all know what the incubator's used for babies. First warm air incubators were used at the Paris Maternity Hospital in 1880 by Dr. Cagnier. They were based on warm chambers for the rearing of poultry devised by the Paris Zoo. So our first human incubators were devised by the zoo, and they had used it to hatch eggs, basically. And that's where we put the babies. And that's sort of what they look like. Some variation of this sort of canvas covered contraption. And you might ask yourself, okay, Don, how do we transition from incubators, babies, to an amusement park? Was it science or was it a sideshow? Martin Cooney exhibited the Tanier incubator at the World Exposition in Berlin in 1896. Here's the killer. They were called child hatcheries, of course. They came from the poultry. Cooney brought 6 weaklings from the public section of the Berlin's charity hospital, and he set up an exhibit at the park between the Congo village and the Tyrolean yogurts. So how much respect did we have for the newborns, for these tiny babies? Well, there was a reason for that. 90 to 95% of them died. They didn't survive. So they were turning them into amusement park exhibitions. Where's the ethics? I'm not sure. Certainly has nothing to do with real care, but it was a huge success. People came and saw that place a lot. Then Cooney immigrated to America. So the amusement park guy came over here in 1903, and of course he settled at Coney Island. And he exhibited these kind of babies for 40 years. So the whole first half of this century basically had neonates, small neonates being shown at amusement park exhibits in these little incubators. And what did we think was wrong with that? He even put his daughter in one for 3 months on exhibit. Here's sort of what those look like. Oh, they got celebrity endorsements too. Can't hurt, can it? Archibald Leach. You all remember Archibald Leach. Who knows who Archibald Leach is?
Cary Grant.
Cary Grant. Very good. They renamed him in Hollywood. Archibald Leach apparently was not going to be an attractive name. You remember Cary, and he was actually a barker at the trying to attract people to that newborn exhibit on Coney Island. We all have to start somewhere. And out of all of this came a medical universal truism. The 2 general requirements in the case of premature infants are the maintenance of body heat and proper nourishment. Duh. What is it you do with a baby when you take it home? Make sure it's warm and fed, right? What differentiates what you do with any baby, or even with another fellow human being? I mean, if that's science, I don't know. Equally important with heat and ventilation, this is the bureaucracy speaking, they got a hold of it, is the rigid exclusion of all persons from the room except the nurse in charge. Even the physician does not enter the room but makes his routine inspection of the child held up to the glass door. So immediately in the hospital, they separated all babies from everyone. And then added this from the Children's Hospital in Toronto: if the children sleep interruptedly, they should be spanked and sprinkled with cold water just previous to feeding. I understand what they're trying to do there, but the methodology is probably not the right way to go. So this is how things were being done 1917, early this century. And they concluded in these high-tech issues like incubators that most of us who have had experience with expensive apparatus for warming babies have discontinued its use. They gave up on technology real quick. I think incubators should be abandoned entirely. This is first technophobic. He was a doctor in New York in 1914. He wanted to get rid of those incubators. I don't know what he wanted to go to. I was in Nigeria in their largest birthing hospital, the Island Maternity Hospital in Lagos. They birth over 10,000 babies a year, and they had a room with incubators in it. None of them were plugged in. There was no nurse. Nobody was there observing them. They were put there to die. They were neither really warmed, because you didn't have to be warmed in Nigeria, and they weren't fed. It was sad. I mean, I've seen a lot of sad things in my life, but that was very sad. And, you know, Dr. Chapin wanted to abandon the whole concept. In 1934, the Chicago Century of Progress Exposition took Cooney's exhibit. It was located on the Midway next to Sally Rand. You remember Sally Rand? Poop Poopy Doo? Was that one of her songs? I remember Marilyn Monroe doing that one, but I wasn't around for Sally Rand. And she was a fan dancer, and they came and arrested her, and when they were arresting her, she complained that those babies had less clothes on than her girls. Clutching at things. When Cooney left Chicago, he left his ambulance there. It became the first premature transport device. And then, you know, you had to just say, what the heck is going on here? How, you know, are we really thinking about this? Are we really doing the kinds of things we should be doing for these babies? And so forth. Sorry, I'm gonna take a slug of water here. I mean, you know, think back through what we've just reviewed there, and some of the things today that are going on, we say, what? Well, back then they had their share. So let's come up to the mid-century, 1940 through 76, and see how things changed. Finally, some legitimacy. New York Hospital, Cornell's unit, there opened the first premature infant station, they called it, and Cooney closed his sideshow for good. So we stepped on a little bit, 1940, you see what happens after that. Well, of course, the war ended and the baby factories emerged. They called them that, the boom. And it went boom in 1946. And that baby boom lasted until 1965. The hospitals were overwhelmed. They couldn't do much in the way of advancing medicine. They were just up to their neck in children and babies. The wards were filled. And these signs went up. You'll remember these signs. You probably went to visit somebody in a maternity ward in a hospital, and on a stanchion in the middle of the corridor was one of these signs: do not disturb babies or with mothers. The signs were about this big, and the nurse in charge administrated that with an iron fist. Nobody got on the maternity floor when that sign was out. Not the father, nobody. And she controlled everything that came and went on that floor, including when the babies went to the mothers and when they were brought back to the nursery. I have one of these in a storage unit someplace. So at least the doctor was allowed inside the glass by then. The father was left outside like a prison telephone out there, always asking, which one of those is mine? And they'd check the bracelet on the little kid and try and figure out if that was the right Simmons baby or not. Because there was very likely going to be more than one with the same last name in the nursery. Those nurseries were jammed, and they used to have accidents where the wrong baby went home with the wrong parents. Post-World War II, and I have to bring up the government again here, they passed a lot of legislation post-World War II. Most of them were giveaway programs. This one was called the Hill-Burton legislation, and it's how the government got its hooks into the finances of hospitals and the bureaucracy and control of how hospitals operated, the regulations. And it was given to mid-sized communities. The government would give up to a third of the cost of a new hospital in a small town that didn't have a hospital. But along with that third of money came a potload of government regulations. And those regulations, which were supposed to be temporary, 6 to 7 years, became in perpetuity by our government. So we still live with the same regulations that were in the Hill-Burton Act from back in the late 40s, early 50s. And I fought those regulations for years because a lot of them made no sense at all. I'll give you one example before we get to the delivery rooms. Delivery rooms, which were cold environments, the reason they was because the regulations in Hill-Burton said they had to meet operating room standards. So all that tile in the wall and so forth, that meant they had to have a 15 per hour turnover of air in that room to keep everybody without infections. Now, imagine you're at the beach. And it's not a nice day at the beach, but you do want to get in the water, and you do, and you find out, hey, the water feels pretty good. I don't have that wind blowing on me and so forth, and it's not as chilly as I thought. But then you have to get out of the water and go, how do you feel when you walk out of that water into a chilly breeze at the beach? And what are you screaming for first? A towel. Somebody bring me a towel, this is horrible, right? Imagine a baby being born out of a warm body and the womb wet into a 15 turnover air exchange of a operating room. Can you imagine that's an environment that if they could only talk? Bring me a blanket. Why am I here? I was really comfortable in that womb. It was shocking to the babies. And yet, it was bureaucracy. We had a regulation about that. We don't know why we had that regulation. I tried to find out. Nobody could actually explain it other than it was the same as operating room standards, even though not a lot of surgery was going on in those rooms. And the surgery that was relatively minor. I know not to the woman, but minor compared to other surgeries. They tied it to the Medicare eventually and Social Security programs, and it went on, and is still going on. And my job became to question these things, to say, why are we doing these things the way we're doing them? And the answer was always the same, because we always have. Because it's in the book there, the regulation book. You even got that response from the fire department, where they wanted to put sprinklers in the neonatal special care units. These are babies with indwelling catheters in them, and they're going to sprinkle the room. I mean, it was totally hazard. And I said, why? He said, because that's the way our code is written. He said, he says, I know what we can do. We'll put powder in the sprinkling system. And I said, so the babies that are on respirators, who cannot be moved, are going to inhale powder from the ceiling? And he was like, Yeah, he says, we'll go to the legislator and get them to change the rules. And then I'll work with you. And that's the kind of stonewalls I hit with all of this. And there I am, 1970, my first day on the job, I think. I was hired by two very southern gentlemen of slightly older years who saw me on day one with a brand new powder pink, this is darker than it really was, double-breasted pinstripe suit. I might as well have gone back working for the mafia. I'm sure it terrorized these two gentlemen, and one of them was so polite about it, they didn't make a big deal. He sidled up next to me and he says, Don, he says, if you're gonna wear that suit, he said, you really ought to take the tag off of the Hey, we were all young once, so we all learned lessons the hard way, right? I started taking pictures as I made the rounds in different hospitals of things. This was a NICU in the 1970s. Took this picture. Who in the medical or anybody knows what this is? Nobody? That's an oxygen outlet from the wall that somebody put a splitter on. You know, we use those for electricity at home and so forth. But then somebody else put a splitter on it, and yet somebody else put a splitter on it to the point where the oxygen system just shut down and said, I'm gonna do this. You got too much going out, and I don't have enough coming in. That's the kind of situation I was running into in the NICUs. The science and the technology was outflanking the facilities very quickly. And those became the problems that had to be solved. This is what I'd run into. There's a baby in there somewhere, tubes and bags and you name it, all around it. But this is not an environment that it looks like you know what you're doing. It looks like something somebody's inventing in their garage. Or they got real clever and said, well, why don't we drop them from the ceiling? Let's bring it all down from the ceiling, get it out of the way, and it'll clean things up a lot. And you can see what it did. I didn't call them this, but staff called them spaghetti factories. And here's what they had to do. To reach things, they had to get on a stool that rolled around on wheels until you stepped on it, then it was supposed to stay in one place. And to get up there, had to brace herself on what? A neonatal bassinet. It has a baby in it, and it's on wheels. That's not a hazard, right? That didn't work. That's what they were trying to do. And it was so crowded. There was just no room. The Hill-Burton legislation called for 40 square feet per baby. 40 square feet isn't much. You know, just not much. It was so crowded. So I got together with my staff. This is one of my staff members, Larry Pointer. Larry's a great guy. We are like brothers today. He, at the time I hired him, had the afro. He was a black, yeah. You can see he had the light blue pinstripe suit on by the time we got there with the vest. But he had toned down by this point a little bit. He's an elder in his church and a great guy, great family. I say that because I want to talk about integration of hospitals here. And if you see that picture of what's on the wall behind those floor plans, that's Grady Hospital. Floor plans for Grady Hospital. It was designed 7 years before it was built. They had to fund it, and it took a long time to fund it. And when they finished the funding, they stayed with the same design they had already paid for when they built Grady Hospital in Atlanta, and it was designed as a totally segregated hospital. It had double of everything. It had double operating room suites. It had double delivery room suites, double patient care units. The only thing in the entire building that was shared was the food service, which came up from the basement and went in two different directions. But they built it anyway. In the meantime, we were desegregating schools and all kinds of things were going on in our country while this sat on the shelf. When they finished and decided they had the money in hand, they built it anyway. And I was hired to desegregate Grady Hospital physically. It's the most, it's changed now over the years, but at the time it was the most inefficient hospital you could ever imagine after I tried to fix it. I also was involved in desegregating lots of hospitals, one of which required a triple desegregation. Now, can you imagine what that might be? I'll give you a hint. It was in Lumberton, North Carolina. Did that help at all?
Yep, Native American.
What do you think?
Native American.
Oh, you're being polite. The Lumbee Indians, they're now Native Americans, right? The Lumbee Indians had their own wing, the blacks had their wing, and the whites had their wing, and we had to bring it together. Something else was going on at that time. I sat in a room with about 12 nursing supervisors around a big boardroom table, and about 30 minutes into the meeting, I couldn't even see the person sitting across the table from me. Why?
Smoke.
Every one of them smoked. It was unbelievable. And when I left there, I went and I was in charge of the Hospital Administration Currents, which is an 8 times a year publication that went out nationally. And I got to pick the topics and the writers and so forth. And I wrote a column in there on smoking in hospitals. And the letter here was signed by Joe Califano. Anybody remember him? He was the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare at the time, and he saw it. And he wrote to my boss and thanked us for having written that article, which was kind of cool. Joseph Califano. Oops, missed one. So my team went off, and Wally T. Prosser, an architect, and I created a way to change all the spaghetti, to get control of all the gases, the oxygen, the suction, the medical air, sometimes nitrous oxide, all of the electrical outlets, and get them in the places they needed to be. And we created what we called the Neonatal Service Shelf System. And we actually patented that. He and I we own a patent on it, never made a nickel on it. Well, $1, we got $1 for it. I kept it, I didn't give him half $1. And this was how we imagined it. And I wrote about it, I did a book on it, and this is how it came into being. And you can see it under construction, and then you can see one when it was finished, and how different that is than the way they were functioning prior to this. Today, every NICU in the country has some variation of that shelf in it to help serve the babies and the caregivers. And man, did they need electrical power. Sick babies are, in my opinion, one of 2 sickest people in the hospital. The other is a burn patient, because their multiple organ systems are giving out. And no other patients have as much, I'm gonna exclude a car accident victim that's, torn from top to bottom, but mostly the sick babies are in that category. This was a unit in the University of Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Paul Perlstein was the NICU director down there, and it was a very modern looking one. He really got into computers and such, and computers were really coming into the caregiving practice as well. 24-hour data, even controlled the heat on the incubators. And Paul became a friend. What I didn't know was going to happen was Paul, he also volunteered time at the Cincinnati Zoo to help them with babies' animals. And he sucked me into that, played a very bad game on me the first time, and had me walk through a door into the face of a bunch of Bengal tigers. It scared the willies out of me. I tell you, they had a hoot about it. But I worked with Paul there at Cincinnati Zoo on a number of projects. In fact, it ended up, I ended up working with zoos all over. Worked with Jungle Jack Hannup in Columbus on gorillas and nurseries for gorillas. I'll just tell you one thing about nurseries for gorillas. Don't plant them with a wall switch where we normally put wall switches. They are very active. They aren't like our babies that we put in bassinets. They're up running around, and they found that wall switch and thought it was the greatest toy ever. It was on and off and on and off, and the nurses said, "You can't live with this." So one of my mistakes. Jeff Pomerantz, also a friend. I put this in here for the engineers, just for them. You don't, the rest of you don't have to read it, because it has the word basic on it for the language system they were using in the Tandy Models 100 and 102 laptops. Okay, that one engineer is impressed. So this was the neonatal service shelf system, and it went into effect in every NICU in the country eventually, and it really helped clear things up. It was just a better workshop for the nurses and doctors. And that's what my goal was, give them a workshop that works. But here's what happened to the neonates over that period of time. In 1917, a 3-pound or less baby had a less than 10% chance of survival. That's why they were using them in the amusement parks and so forth. It was just something to be tossed away. We weren't going to save it anyway. And it's sad. By 1970, we spiffed up those NICUs and so forth, and the mortality rate dropped where it was a 50-50 chance they'd survive. And by year 2000, it was a 10 to 15% chance they would survive. I mean, they would die, not survive. It flipped completely over that period of time. And it did for a combination of things, and I got to play a little role in that as well along the way. The average length of stay went way up from 7 days to 30 because we were saving the babies. But it took a lot longer to get them able to go home. And I pushed the square footage up from 40 from the regulations to 120. They've since gone to 150. I don't disagree with that, but I think it reaches a point where the nurses are too far separated from one another. They can't assist each other enough. And I made a big issue about that. Nobody paid attention. But the support space as well went way up, and that was needed. So 76 to present, I'm going to shift to LDR and LDRP rooms here. Good, enough time I think to do this. The problem, as I saw it as a puzzle solver in the mid-70s, was that the way hospitals functioned for women and birth was they had multi-bed labor rooms. They had operating room, we talked about like delivery rooms. They had multi-bed recovery rooms, and what I mean here is there was no privacy. Fathers were often not involved, not allowed to come in to any of these places. And then they went to a postpartum ward, which was mostly semi-private postpartum rooms. It was a heck of a progress from labor to postpartum and going home. Length of stay was about 5 days at that point. It had been reduced from 7 days when my mother birthed me in 1946. And the nursery supervisor took charge of the baby and dictated when and how long that baby could be with the mother each day. Now, imagine these baby boom women who are now starting to give birth. Remember them? Were they good cooperative citizens? Did they like the government? Did they like what was going on in our country? Or do you remember other things? Well, the other things took over, and they said that they didn't want to be a part of this institutional birthing. It was an assembly line institutional birth with a sergeant major in the nursery, and they couldn't see their husbands, and they just said, we've had it with hospitals, we're going home. So I sat and met with lots of these women. We meet in the evening in some bank's conference room. We sit on the floor in circles with our legs crossed. You can picture it, right? Probably some of you have been there. Some of them were breastfeeding, some had little kids running around. And we talk about what's the problem? How come? And I had women that said, I'll never have another baby if I have to have it in a hospital. And I thought, that's a shame. And so I asked them what the problem, what was the barrier, and the barrier was the institutionalization. They weren't sick, they didn't feel sick, but the hospital treated them like they were sick patients when they were admitted. So I started thinking, well, how do we get a grasp on that? The forces at work were fourfold. There was science, it was just growing in leaps and bounds. There was technology, the computers were all coming on board. There was economics, which had an impact on everything and still does. And then finally we had compassion and ethics. And the question was, which of these quadrants wins? Who's pushing who? And unfortunately, at that point in time, compassion was dropping like a rock. And these other things were taking over, and these women said, nope, not on our watch. That's not gonna happen. So they started exploring all kinds of other births. And I said, what if the hospital, where we all know there's safety backup, what if the hospital could give you most of what you're looking for? Well, that was what they call a paradigm flip for the hospital to think that way and to do that. But I said to myself, here I am, just turning 30, mid-70s, but I was a part of all the worlds that needed to have input to solve this problem. I was born in that first ripple of the baby boom. I was culturally in sync with the women. I was working with hospitals and trying to improve their workshop for mainstream medicine. I had specialty planning skills in OB and pediatrics, having both invented and patented the neonatal shelf as well as written books on perinatal pediatric care facilities. I had in-depth knowledge of childbirth, both from institutional perspective and midwifery perspective, because I had been working with Meharry and working in Africa with the midwives. I had experience working with all levels of power brokers, both in and out of medicine, so nobody was intimidating me. I'd been mentioned in both the old school, had been mentored in the old school methods as well as the creative future prognostication. So I understood both of those. I had too much self-confidence, I'll just say that right up front, for my own good. But maybe just enough to tackle a near impossible situation. I had done that in prior successes. That Texas project, which was enormous, 110 hospitals, the remote international incidences that I was involved in, the near-death experiences, and some national recognition. And finally, I had a staff of exceptional people with sufficient annual budget to pursue any facility application I wanted to, as long as it had to do with obstetrics and pediatrics. I don't think anybody else had this background in the country. So it was that old question, if not me, then who? So I took off on this idea, and we wanted to get from here and from here, the Fesso ward. I had to chase a snake out of that ward when I was there, some kind of a viper, or no, what was it? I don't know. And there's no screens on the windows or anything, so anything can come in and go out as it chooses to. And here's a maternity home picture. This was one of the midwives that I met with in Tennessee, and I went over and visited her in her maternity home. And you see those windows upstairs on the inside. This is what it looked like. That was her bed for birthing. The windows are wide open. Anything can come in and out. And the sink is a little, you'd be a little misguided. There was no hot water in that sink. So she just had cold running water. But she had running water, which was not bad. It took determination. My heart was with the moms, my head understood the barriers that the caregivers, administrators, designer faced, and what they would be this paradigm change, flipping everything they do. And physicians and nurses were entrenched in those protocols, the procedures, the beliefs on caregiving and control. Administrators and architects and engineers were enslaved by the regulations and the codes. I had to change a lot of regulations and codes. It was not easy to do. Yet God put a vision in my head and gave me the resources and the context to accomplish it. I just stayed focused on a singular goal of creating a place within the safety of a hospital walls where a birthing woman could experience the greatest miracle of life and not be felt she was a sick patient. The vision, a room comfortable enough for labor, sufficient in size and technology for a safe birth, and home-like enough for a family recovery, private enough for baby and mother to stay together for postpartum care. They called it couplet care. Tom Barton helped a lot. He was the chairman of OBGYN at University of Cincinnati Medical Center, and he arranged, I asked, and he said yes, for me to meet with, in one meeting, perinatologists, neonatologists, OBs, peds, anesthesia, nurses from all disciplines, respiratory, even the housekeeper in the lab in this meeting. And I presented the vision or the model, and I had a certain expectation, but I was surprised when they said they wanted their highest risk mothers to be in that room. I thought it was going to be a low risk kind of situation. And they said no. They said it's the riskiest time in a mother's birthing experience to be moved from labor when they decide the labor's not working well to a delivery room down a hallway somewhere and assemble the team. And they said they want to be able to make that happen right there on that bed. So I went and talked to really expert doctors. I had a lot of experts at my disposal and got their opinion on the whole thing, and went back to work with my drawings and came up with a situation that I then wrote a book on called Alternatives for Obstetric Design. And in it, I described, this isn't it, but I described what we call the LDR room, Labor Delivery Recovery Room. And we called it that because to give it any kind of modern title would have turned off the medical people. We knew that. We didn't want to use the word alternative in the title, for example, because we knew that would turn them off. So the embryo of that idea grew and some bones got on it because we wrote the book and circulated that around. We called it the Combination Labor Delivery Recovery Room. Later, the medical people called it the LDR room. We looked at the function, and this book was circulated. Wrote about it in Hospital Administration Currents, and it had a big mailing list. And I was 33 at the time, by the time we got this book out. And my white knight came along, Dr. Richard Schmidt. Because remember, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, I'm not even a woman. I had 3 strikes against me going into this. I kid about that. I used to go to conferences and give speeches to 100 nurses. And they would require, review lists and so forth. And 95% of them would think it was fabulous. They loved it. And the other 5% said I was crap. And I needed to get out, dragged out by my feet and burned at the stake. It was only because I was a guy. And I'm sorry, but they didn't want a guy telling them what a woman should need. And we were, you remember those times. Anyway, Dr. Schmidt, he was past president of ACOG, the American College of OBGYN, which gave him, as they say in Washington, gravitas, and chairman of OBGYN for the Good Samaritan Hospital in Cincinnati. I didn't know him. He called a cold call and he wanted to meet with me and discuss this concept, which he may have heard about from the Cincinnati folks in town, or maybe he got a hold of my book, I don't know. And he didn't want to build a last traditional OB department in the US. He had a bunch of money and he was about to build one. And I presented the concept to about 30 of his obstetricians, One of them walked out of the meeting and slammed the door so hard the walls shook. I mean, they shook. And I left the room and they voted 30-0 against the concept. This was a tough setback for me. However, Dr. Schmidt, my white knight, he decided to take 2 of their labor rooms out of service, spend $10,000 and create an LDR room and try it out. So that was the first one that actually came off the pages of a book. His assistant, Rosalind Friedman, and I developed questionnaires to be completed by the MDs and by the families and by the nurses after every birth, and he force-fed that room. So every time it was cleaned up, the next baby that came into the unit, regardless of who the doctor was, had to use that room. And after 3 months, he called off the study, and he got his people back together. They voted again, and this time they were 30-0 in favor of it. That's flipping the paradigm. And we published, Rosalind and I published in Modern Healthcare magazine the results, and in modern terms, the baby was born, as our people would say, it went viral. The medical community read all about it, saw what was going on, saw about the success that they had there at Good Samaritan Hospital, and they started endorsing it. In fact, that wasn't where the first one was built. The first one was built in Minneapolis because they just took a wing they already had and gutted it and remodeled it with LDR rooms. The P came along when length of stay dropped to the point where they could just stay there for postpartum as well and be discharged straight from that room. So LDR and LDRP. Either model works. LDRs work in large birth services, teaching centers and so forth. The LDRP works better in a small birth service where they don't have residents and interns running around and all that. It goes by many names, but I don't care. As long as babies are warm and fed, like they said back in 1917, and they're with mom, I don't care what they call the room. But every obstetric unit in the country now has LDRs or LDRP rooms in their unit, and they compose the bulk of the unit. I've left out a lot of things. I've left out, there's other ways to give birth. The La Boyer system, which is a water birth. I was involved with a number of units, especially out in Denver. They didn't have meetings, like prenatal meetings with moms and dads. They had prenatal encounter groups in Denver. And they wanted to do water births in their hospital, which is birthing underwater. And I don't have any problem with that. In fact, there's a lot of support for it. But they still need a place. And this is kind of what a typical LDR room would look like if there were a patient in that bed. With the high-tech stuff gets rolled out of a room, set up, the birth is complete, they have the light they need, and when the birth is over, all that stuff goes back in a room that is later reprocessed, and it becomes a recovery room and then a postpartum room, and the father is welcome at all times. He's not useful at all times. I did a study on that. They have what's called doulas. Am I saying that right? Doulas, excuse me, I knew that. That comes from living here and getting old. Basically they are trained women who help other women during birth. And of course we went through the whole stage where the father went to all the classes and everything and learned how to do it and so forth. My study determined that in fact, any woman, even one brought off the sidewalk in the street, was better at helping that mother at birth than the father. The fathers just don't connect that way. So anyway, there's fads that go through, birthing. As I said, they're not sick patients. You can do it a lot of different ways. You can do it in the back seat of a taxi cab if you have to. But this is the environment that was created to support it. And that's what I'm looking for right there. She's warm, she's fed, she's happy. I did a few other things. I planned the first in vitro fertilization lab in the U.S. With Dr. Georgiana Jones and her husband. She's the hero in that pair in Norfolk, Virginia. I got a little squishy on the ethical side of things with that. I worked with Dr. Robert Usher at the Royal Vic Hospital in Montreal, where we created the first light spectrum cure for bilirubinemia. I was trying to build his new neonatal unit, and we had no place to put the babies, and he found a sun porch to put them on temporarily, and then we noticed that during the time they were on the sun porch, they weren't getting bilirubin anemia. They were not getting jaundice. And said, what's changed here? Nothing except the sun. And so I went to GE at their Nela Park Labs in Cleveland, and I said, all right, we got a medical thing we're trying to achieve here, and we'd like to see a bulb that has a spectrum in it that's much like the sun. It's a natural spectrum. And they created it, and I took it back to Montreal and we installed it, and the rate of bilirubinemia dropped like a rock. And now that's all they use in nurseries anymore to combat that. And I worked with Dr. Gary Benfield at Akron Children's Hospital to create the first parent overnight room. His problem, Gary was an amazing guy, he just died recently. He was an electrical engineer that was also a neonatologist, and he had a doctorate degree in psychology. And he really cared for his families and his patients. And his problem was that after they had kept a baby 15 to 30 days in the NICU, and the parents only got to see him through that little glass container and didn't hardly get to touch him and so forth, to announce, all right, your baby's tired, it can go home now, was a real problem for the parents. They were petrified. They would take the baby home, and the first night they would call and say, we're bringing the baby back to the hospital. This has gone wrong, that's gone wrong. Well, nothing had gone wrong. They just didn't know how to interpret it. And so I said, well, do you have a room near the NICU we could take and use? And I said, let's convert it to a hotel room. And let's let the parents take the baby there for the first night. So they're within touch of the neonatal unit. And it gave them the support. They didn't need the help. They just were afraid of being so far from the help. And they panicked. And a night or two in that room turned out to be a real financial boost for the hospital, because readmitting a patient is very expensive. And now every neonatal unit in the country has a parent overnight room or two near it somewhere, and use it that way. And that's thanks to Gary and his implementation. So what's next? I don't know. The boy A, he wrote a book, Birth Without Violence. He also died recently, not recently, but within the last 10 years. Underwater births, I don't know. Safety first. No risk births, no such thing. As I see the world screaming for safety everywhere, not just in hospitals, it seems to me that we're becoming far less safe. So we're doing something wrong. And it's not just about babies, it's our whole social structure. And I can't fix that. Are we going to get squeezed out of hospitals for financial reasons? Probably. Are in vitro labs and NICUs, are they going to be limited by cost or ethics? Probably. Sometimes babies are precious, sometimes they're a burden, such as in China, when they put in the one-child policy in China because they were a burden to their society. I think we have to decide where that fits. We won't go into this. This is Dr. Jones and her IV lab. And then I did go to China and I studied their medicine over in China, and I found their ambulance system really interesting. Thought you might enjoy that one. I'd be glad to answer any questions. For those of you who are already sick of listening to me, you're welcome to leave. I won't take it personally. I hope you've enjoyed and learned a few things here. It's my story from the perspective of what I did for a living and the kinds of things that I hopefully was able to impact our healthcare system with. Thank you all for coming. And I will, if there are any questions about anything, if anybody wants to stay and ask. Yes?
How did you get paid?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. You don't know how good that question is. How did I get paid? Well, when I worked for 10 years with Abbott and Ross Laboratories, I had a very unique job. The Ross Laboratories sold Similac infant formula, but they sold it to the public. They didn't sell it to the hospitals. They gave it away to the hospitals. They just wanted the contract for the hospital to accept it. The hospitals did not sell Similac. They gave it away to the patients and hoped that they would go home and then go to the retail store and buy Similac. So my department did not get paid for what we did. We went and consulted for free with hospitals in the hopes that they would think Ross Laboratories was a really nice place. It is that simple. Their sales reps were not allowed to be with us when we were on site. We kept as long an arm of professionalism as we could, but we literally, and if you look up here, I just brought in two of them. This is a report on Orlando and East Central Florida's pediatric situation and a recommendation of them to build a pediatric hospital. We did that report for the Pediatric Society in that area, in Orlando area, and from that came the Arnold Palmer Children's Hospital in Orlando. We would do these kinds of studies in depth for free. And we hoped that, and they did, appreciate Ross Labs for doing that, so they could give away their formula for free. And so the answer to your question is, I got paid out of some kind of money that went around the corner and back into the retail store and back to Ross.
It was marketing.
It was good marketing. It doesn't exist anymore. They discontinued it. Abbott bought Ross. Abbott is not into doing things that don't make an immediate profit. So they discontinued the program completely. I was gone before they did that. I saw the writing on the wall. I knew that the High Shades fellas were going to be looking for places to make cuts, and that was an obvious one to them. They didn't look underneath that to see the value. But we were very successful and affected so many units across the country, so many hospitals. And I was involved in creating about 10 or 12 children's hospitals as well that didn't exist at all. Another question, yes?
Well, John, I've heard that our system for having babies and having them viable is way behind many other countries in Europe and
That's not necessarily true. I've heard that. And then people that say that, they look at numbers, they look at statistics, and they say, well, we don't have as good a rate of this or that or whatever. But their societies are not as homogeneous, they are much more homogeneous than ours is. So if you go to Sweden, well, they now have a bit of an influx, but you go to Sweden and everybody's Swedish. And everybody conforms to what they're trying to do and their education systems and so forth. You come here to South Carolina and you go from the coastal area to the mountains and you'll see a tremendous difference in education, cleanliness, you name it. And it's unbelievable. And we have to deal with that. And those numbers from the coast where they have bad results because people don't go to the doctor and people don't take their medicine and people don't do a lot of things reflected in the general population. So I don't think it's not an easy study to do and declare that. I would say in the world that I've been in, and I've been in a lot of countries, now we still have first-class people and facilities to take care of things. The things we have to take care of are often much worse And that's because of the way we live, the roads we drive on, the education system that we have, the cultural differences that exist. So that would be my response to that. It's hard to measure. Some studies are really hard to do. And people that do them usually have an agenda. So you gotta watch for that all the time. Anybody else?
Don, about what year was the LDR rooms?
Well, it was created in my mind in 1976, excuse me.
Okay.
The first one was built about 1978, and I published a book on it by 1980.
Okay.
And so it was that period of time that it sort of emerged, but as I said, it didn't go viral until I got published in some national journals, and I started doing speeches on it and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Anybody have a bad question? Yeah, I was blessed in a career that I got to work with really smart people. Anybody familiar with the APGAR score? You know what it is?
The test they do on babies.
So it's done on babies. It's done on at 2 minutes and 5 minutes after a baby is born. They are subjected to the APGAR score. It was created by Virginia APGAR. She was not an obstetrician, she was an anesthesiologist. Brilliant woman, broke a lot of glass ceilings on things. She became an anesthesiologist because her professors at Columbia University told her that women in surgery, and she graduated very high in her surgical class, could not have good practices. And anesthesiology as a medical component didn't exist at that time. It was mostly nurse administered, and it wasn't a professional society as such. She created that, and she created the APGAR score, which is still used today.
My grandson passed the APGAR testing with flying colors.
Uh-huh.
He was delayed in walking,
Hmm.
and it was 18 months before Children's Hospital.
Wow.
The pediatrician was at fault. He
Uh-huh.
was then sent to Children's Hospital, and they immediately diagnosed him. He had had a stroke in utero.
Ah, wow, how rare. Yeah, that would be a hard thing to know about a stroke in utero.
They call it a form of cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
He's a Paralympic skier today.
Oh, wow. But it wasn't detected by the APGAR score in that case.
Not at all. He is brilliant, but
Well, I knew Virginia APGAR, which was really cool. She was elderly at the time, but she was still bright. I think she lived into her 70s, somewhere into her 70s, but she was a brilliant person. And sorry that didn't work out in that case, but it's still being used.
well, it was the pediatrician, because there were things that his other grandmother and I had picked up on.
Ah,
And
yeah,
it was
yeah.
a young
Good.
couple is afraid to find out
Good.
sometimes what the truth is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
is this APGAR score?
What is it?
Yeah.
It's a very simple, I think it's 5 points or 6 points that are used to evaluate a baby as soon as it's born. And
And what
it has to do with things like color, heart rate, and very basic physical situations. But she developed this recognizing, that's what she did, was obstetrical anesthesiology, and recognizing that children who didn't score high on the APGAR score later developed problems. So it was to get those problems early. And it was done twice, at 2 minutes after birth and then 5 minutes after birth. That evaluation. If the baby passed both of those, it's a pretty good chance the baby was going to be normal and not have other problems crop up in the nursery. Anybody else? Well, nobody wants to know what I did with the mafia. Okay, all right. We'll just, that's between you and me, and we don't need to talk about that.
That's part 2 of your life story.
Well, that's
Part
part
two.
2, that's right. Amy, if you work me in, I'll be glad to do it.
I wanna hear that too.
We'll get to more of the story parts of my weird life. Thank you all.
I figured you might still be proud of me.
Well,